I was never meant to be a soldier. My life before the war was written in the soil rows of wheat that bent under the summer sun. The call of roosters at dawn and the rhythm of a plow pulled through heavy earth. I was born in a small village tucked among the rolling hills of northern France, where life followed the seasons and little else ever changed. My family was poor, but we carried our burdens quietly. My father's hands were like gnarled roots from years of labor, his back bent by the fields. My mother rose before the light each day to tend to the animals and bake the coarse bread that kept us alive. I was their eldest son since my older brother, our firstborn, had died in an accident years before. His absence hung in the air like an invisible weight, a reminder that I was now the one expected to carry the family forward. I remember the day I first thought of leaving. The posters had appeared overnight, pasted to the walls of the town hall and on the stone sides of the bakery. Bright colors, red, white, blue-painted scenes of men in uniform marching boldly across fields, bayonets fixed, flags raised high. Their faces bore smiles, their postures the confidence of victors. A la patrie, the words shouted. For the fatherland. Glory and honor await. I was 19 years old, too young to understand the permanence of death, but old enough to feel the sting of shame when neighbors whispered about those who had not yet volunteered. Boys I had known since childhood stood taller in their uniforms. Girls leaned closer to hear their laughter before they left for training. Every departure was a performance, the band playing at the station. Mothers wiping tears with pride as much as sorrow. Fathers clapping sons on the back with a force meant to disguise trembling hands. I told myself. I wanted to serve out of love for my country, that it was my duty as a Frenchman. But truthfully, I was afraid of being left behind. To stay in the fields while others went to war felt like cowardice. And when the recruiters came, stern men in crisp coats who promised we'd be home by Christmas, triumphant and decorated, I signed my name with a hand that trembled from excitement, not fear. Life before the war seemed like another world, a fragile dream now fading. Europe had been living in what the newspapers called the Belle Epoque, the beautiful era. Our villages glowed with gas lamps. Trains linked cities and music drifted from the cafes. There had been talk of new inventions, flying machines, automobiles, even telephones. To me, these were distant marvels. My world was simpler. A stretch of farmland, the quiet toll of the church bell, the smell of freshly turned soil after rain. Yet even in our little village, the currents of history were stirring. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo, I barely understood who he was. A foreign prince in a faraway land, what did it matter to me? But within weeks, alliances flared like dry tinder. Newspapers screamed of mobilization. Germany had threatened. Russia had answered, and soon France was bound by duty and treaties older than my lifetime. Suddenly, war was no longer a rumor. It was a certainty, and the first, swept along by the tide, had become one of its countless soldiers. I can still see the morning I left. The fields stretched golden in the late summer light, a breeze stirring the stalks as though the earth itself were whispering farewell. My mother stood on the threshold, clutching a handkerchief, her eyes glistening though she tried to hide it. My father shook my hand instead of embracing me, the grip firm, the silence heavier than any words. My younger sister, barely 12, stared at me as though trying to memorize my face. I kissed the crown of her head, breathing in the scent of soap and hay, and promised I would return before the first snow inside me. Two voices warred. One said I was about to embark on the greatest adventure of my life, a chance to prove myself worthy of respect and pride. The other whispered a doubt I dared not speak aloud. What if I never saw these hills again? What if this farewell was the last? The train station was a carnival of sound and color. The platform teemed with young men like me, clutching small bags and letters tucked in pockets. Some joked loudly, their laughter forced but infectious. Others stood quietly, eyes fixed on mothers, sweethearts, or wives they were leaving behind. The band played a triumphant march, drowning out the sobs, while flags waved overhead. I tried to hold my head high, to look brave, but when the whistle blew and the wheels screeched forward, my stomach sank like a stone. The train carried us eastward, deeper into the unknown. Outside the window, the countryside blurred by villages, rivers, fields, all the ordinary things I had known my whole life. Yet as each mile passed, I felt them slipping away, as though I were leaving not only my home, but myself behind. In those first hours, the war was still an idea. We spoke of it as though it were a game, quick battles, bold charges, medals pinned to our chests. Some of the men boasted about how they would impress the girls when they returned in uniform. Others swore they would write songs about our victories. I joined in their laughter, though inside my chest I felt the first stirring of unease. Night fell, and I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching the stars wheel overhead. I thought of my mother kneeling at her bedside, whispering prayers into the silence. I thought of the soil beneath our farmhouse, heavy and black, waiting for the spring plow. I thought of my brother's grave and whether one day I would lie in the earth beside him. Just another name etched in stone. I did not yet know what awaited me, the stench of the trenches, the roar of shells, the sight of men torn apart by steel. All I knew was that I had stepped across a line that could never be crossed back, and as the train rattled into the dark, I promised myself one thing, that I would remember. No matter what happened, no matter if I returned or not, I would carry the memory of my home, my family, and the fields of my childhood like a lantern in the storm, because deep down, I already sensed the truth. I might not come back. The station was a storm of bodies and sound. Flags snapped in the late summer wind, their colors bright against a sky streaked with smoke from the coal engines. Brass horns blared a marching tune, but the music was drowned by the cries of mothers, the shouts of officers, the rattle of boots on cobblestones. Everywhere I looked, there were faces, neighbors, schoolmates, men from nearby villages pressed shoulder to shoulder, all swept into the tide of war. I carried my small pack awkwardly, feeling both proud and uncertain. Around me, boys barely older than children laughed too loudly, jostling one another as if to prove they weren't afraid. Others stood stiff and pale, clutching caps in their hands. The air smelled of sweat, dust, perfume from the flowers being thrust into departing hands. I saw my family at the edge of the crowd. My mother's eyes found mine instantly. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled, and the handkerchief she gripped was already damp. My father stood beside her, his jaw set, his shoulders square. He did not reach for me. Instead, he held out his hand with a grip so firm it felt like a command to be strong. My little sister clung to my sleeve, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She was too young to understand why I had to go. Only that I was leaving. I bent to kiss her hair, whispering a promise I wasn't sure I could keep, that I would be home soon, before the first snow fell. Then the whistle shrieked, and the train lurched. My mother's hand slipped from mine. My sister's cry rose above the crowd, and suddenly I was carried away with the others. Waving bravely, even as fear tightened in my chest, asterisk. They stripped away the last pieces of our old lives the moment we reached the training camp. Our clothes were taken, and in their place came uniforms of coarse wool that scratched at the skin and smelled faintly of mothballs. The trousers were either too long or too short, the boots stiff and ill-fitting. My rifle was a battered piece of steel, heavy in my hands and slick with grease. Still, I cradled it as though it were a prize, telling myself this was the first step toward becoming a real soldier. The days unfolded with brutal rhythm. At dawn, the sergeants barked us awake, and we stumbled into lines, eyes bleary, bodies aching from the cold ground. We marched for hours under the weight of packs that dug into our shoulders, circling the fields until our legs quivered. We learned to dig trenches long, shallow scars carved into the earth shoveling, until blisters split our palms. Then filling them again when the officers decided they were in the wrong place. Rifle practice was worse. The first time I fired, the recoil slammed into my shoulder so hard it left a bruise the size of an apple. Smoke stung my eyes, and the target remained unmarked. Around me, boys laughed at their own misfires, boasting to cover their embarrassment. One lad declared he'd shot a sparrow out of the sky by accident, and the others roared, though the sound was thin and nervous at first. There was excitement, a sense that we were playing at something grand. But after days of endless marching, aching muscles, and sleepless nights, the glamour wore away. My body grew heavier, my spirit dulled. Each command barked at us reminded me less of honor and more of servitude, yet in the evenings we still managed to laugh. Around the fires, we told jokes, traded bits of bread, and teased one another for our clumsiness. We laughed not because we were fearless, but because fear pressed so close that laughter was the only shield we had left. The weeks dragged on, and the weight of training pressed harder with each day. My shoulders burned from the endless marches, the straps of my pack carving red lines into my skin. My hands were raw from the shovel, blisters torn open and bleeding, only to harden again into calluses. Sleep came in snatches, broken by the sergeant's shouts or the chill that crept through the thin canvas of the tents. Even when I closed my eyes, exhaustion kept me restless, my dreams filled with the thunder of imagined guns. At first, I had worn my uniform with pride, believing I was stepping into a noble destiny. I had carried myself tall, certain that I was defending my country, certain that glory waited just ahead. But now, as the days blurred into a haze of pain and fatigue, that confidence began to crumble. Each time I stumbled during a march or missed the target at the range, I felt less like a hero and more like a farm boy trapped in boots too large for him. Rumors spread quickly through the camp, whispered in the dark when the sergeants could not hear. Some said entire battalions had been cut to pieces in Belgium, that villages had been flattened under German artillery. Others spoke of trenches stretching for miles, filled with mud and corpses. We laughed nervously, pretending not to believe, but the truth seeped in all the same. It was not the quick, glorious adventure the newspapers promised. It was something longer, harsher, far more merciless. I began to wonder if I had been a fool, if the posters at the town square had sold me a lie. My pride had been replaced by questions I dared not voice, questions that gnawed at me with every aching step. What exactly were we marching toward? Dand? Would any of us return? That night, after another day of drills and mud, I sat hunched over a scrap of paper by the dim glow of a lantern. The camp was quiet except for the coughs and snores of exhausted men, but my hands trembled as I held the pen. It was time to write my first letter home. I began with cheerful lies. Dearest mother, I am well. The food is plentiful. The training is going smoothly. And the officers say, we are learning quickly. My words flowed easily, though none of them were true. The bread was stale, the training left us broken, and the officers cursed us more often than they praised. But I wanted her to picture me strong, confident, marching proudly toward victory. I told her not to worry, that the rumors of hardship were exaggerated, that soon I would be home to help with the harvest. By Christmas, I promised, as though writing the words could make them real. I could almost see her face as she read them, her brow smoothing, her lips curving into a smile, her faith in me unshaken. Yet as I wrote, doubt gnawed at me. I paused often, staring at the ink stain spreading across the page. My heart whispered truths my hand refused to record, that I was tired beyond measure, that fear clung to me like a shadow, that already I missed the sound of the wind across our fields more than I could bear. When I sealed the envelope, I pressed it to my lips before handing it to the courier. My promise lingered there, that I would return soon. But deep inside, I wondered if I had just written the first of many lies to the woman who had given me life. The order came suddenly. We were to march to the front. At dawn, our company assembled, packs strapped tightly, rifles slung across sore shoulders. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the promise of rain. A hush settled over us as the column stretched into the road, and then, with a barked command, we began. At first, the march almost felt like a parade. Villagers lined the lanes, waving flags and shouting blessings. Women handed us bread and apples. Children ran alongside until they tired, their laughter echoing in the morning air. We raised our chins and tried to smile, pretending to be the proud heroes they believed us to be. I caught the eyes of one old man who tipped his cap, his gaze solemn, and in that moment I wondered if he saw us as sons, marching not to triumph, but to slaughter. The miles piled on, and the weight of our packs grew unbearable. The straps dug into my shoulders until I thought the skin would tear. My boots rubbed raw blisters that burst and bled, yet there was no stopping. Men dropped from exhaustion, only to be kicked back to their feet by the sergeant's boot or hauled upright by comrades. The songs we had sung at the beginning died on our lips, replaced by the steady rhythm of boots on dirt and the ragged sound of our breath. We passed fields and villages I had never seen. Their windows shuttered, their streets eerily empty. It felt as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for what lay ahead. At night we collapsed in barns or under hedgerows, too tired even to speak. My dreams were filled with marching. An endless road stretching toward some nameless horizon. The front grew nearer with each day, though none of us had seen it yet. Rumors swirled trenches, barbed wire, guns that shook the earth. I tried to picture it, but my imagination failed. All I knew was that we were walking toward something vast and inevitable, and that with every step, home slipped further behind. As we marched closer to the front, whispers and fragments of news filtered through the ranks. Some came from newspapers passed hand to hand, others from veterans who had already tasted the fighting. The great battles had begun. Meaux, Charleroi, the Marne, names of rivers and towns that once meant nothing to me now, carried the weight of thousands of lives. I learned that the war had not unfolded as the generals promised. The Germans had advanced with terrifying speed through Belgium, their armies sweeping across the countryside like a storm. The French and British had fought desperately to halt them. At the Marne, just weeks earlier, the fields had run red with blood. Though the enemy had been pushed back, the price was staggering. We began to hear of trenches lines dug into the earth, stretching for miles where men lived and died in the mud. At first, I thought it an exaggeration. Surely no army would choose to rot in ditches. But the rumors grew too consistent to ignore, both sides locked in stalemate, neither able to advance without suffering horrendous losses. The word "Unnamed" spread among us, though no officer dared speak it aloud. What had begun as a promise of swift victory was already hardening into something slower, heavier, endless. And with every story, my heart sank further, though I tried to tell myself it would not be so for us. One evening, after a long day of marching, we huddled together near a small fire in the corner of a barn. The smoke curled up through broken beams, and the glow lit our tired faces. For the first time in days, the sergeants left us alone, and conversation drifted between us like fragile sparks. Henry, the oldest among us, broke the silence. He pulled a worn photograph from his pocket and showed it in the firelight. A woman with kind eyes, holding two small children. "My wife, my girls," he said softly. "I promised them I would be back before the spring." His voice cracked, but he quickly tucked the photo away, as if hiding the vulnerability. Etienne grinned, leaning on his cane from his still healing leg. "Spring? I'll be back by Christmas," he said, his tone half joking, half defiant. "They'll throw a parade for us, and the girls in Marseille will be fighting over who gets to dance with me first." Laughter rippled around the circle, thin but welcome. Then Louis spoke, barely above a whisper. He was only 17, his cheeks still soft. "My fiancée writes to me every week," he said. "She says she prays every night I'll come home safe." He swallowed hard, eyes shining in the firelight. "I told her I would. I have to." No one answered at first. We all wanted to believe his words, but the silence told another truth that none of us could be sure. I stared into the flames, listening to their crackle, and forced a smile I did not feel. Hope was all we had, and even that felt fragile in the shadows. The first time I climbed down into the trench, it felt as though I were descending into the underworld. The sunlight vanished quickly behind me, replaced by the dim, suffocating gloom of walls slick with mud. The air was so thick with rot and smoke that I gagged before I had taken 3 steps. Water sloshed around my boots, rising almost to my ankles, and the mud clung like glue with every movement. It was not the kind of dirt I had known on the farm, the honest earth that smelled of rain and seed. This was foul, stagnant, poisoned soil that seemed to swallow men whole. Rats ran freely along the duckboards, fat and fearless from feeding on scrap sand on bodies. One leapt across my path, its teeth bared, and I heard a man curse as another darted up his sleeve. I tried not to look, but it was impossible to ignore the pale hand protruding from a collapsed section of wall. Someone had been buried there, half covered by the earth, left because there was neither time nor strength to dig him out. The sound was constant. Artillery never stopped. The thunder rolled day and night, so steady that silence became the rarest sound of all. Shells whistled overhead before crashing somewhere in the distance, shaking the boards and showering clods of dirt onto our helmets. Even when the guns paused, my ears still rang, the echoes lingering like a phantom roar. I felt my body tense with every noise, my heart pounding as though trying to escape my chest. The sergeant barked for us to keep moving, to take our places, but my legs felt heavy, uncooperative. I peered out through a narrow slit and saw the land ahead, a stretch of desolation scarred with craters. Barbed wire twisted like broken teeth, the remnants of trees standing like blackened skeletons. They called it no man's land, and I understood instantly why. The men around me tried to make light of it. One joked that at least the rats were well fed. Another muttered that the mud would preserve us like fossils when we died. Laughter rippled briefly, hollow and thin, quickly swallowed by the rumble of the guns. I forced myself to join in, though my mouth was dry and my stomach churned. I had marched to war believing I was a soldier. But in that moment, standing knee-deep in filth, choking on smoke and fear, I realized I was nothing more than another body thrown into the earth. And the earth, indifferent, was already waiting to claim me. Asterisk, the order came at dawn, carried on the damp chill of morning mist. We had barely finished choking down our ration of bread and thin coffee when the sergeant appeared, his voice already hoarse from shouting. "Prepare to advance," he barked, as if the words were no different than telling us to clean our rifles. But the silence that followed told us otherwise. Everyone understood what advance meant. It meant leaving the meager safety of these mud walls and climbing into the open, where the sky itself seemed to rain bullets. The trench suddenly came alive with motion. Men checked their rifles again and again, not because they thought it would matter, but because their hands needed something to do. Bayonets clicked into place with metallic certainty. Packs were tightened, straps pulled across shoulders. Someone crossed himself quickly, fingers trembling. Another man pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket, scribbling a note that might never be delivered. I watched him fold it carefully and tuck it inside his tunic. Over his heart, I felt the weight of my own rifle like a burden I could hardly carry. My palms were slick, my throat dry. My legs wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. I told myself to be brave, to remember the speeches, the flags, the promises of honor, but none of that mattered here. Here, the only truth was fear. When the lieutenant strode past, his uniform clean despite the filth around him, he spoke as though reciting lines from a book. "This is your duty. France expects courage." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. I saw the flicker of doubt there, the knowledge that most of us would not return. Still, he shouted the words, and we were expected to obey as the minutes dragged. The waiting was worse than the fight I imagined. The trench was too narrow, the air too stale. My heart hammered so loudly I thought the men beside me could hear it. I wiped my hands on my trousers, though they immediately grew damp again. A whistle hung from the sergeant's lips, and I hated it more than anything in the world, because I knew the moment it shrieked, it would send us into hell. When the first whistle blew, sharp and merciless, time seemed to stop. Men surged forward, boots scraping ladders, hands pushing, voices crying out. I climbed with them, against every instinct, because to remain behind was unthinkable. And as I lifted myself into the pale morning light, I felt as though I were stepping not into battle, but into the jaws of death itself. Asterisk, the instant I pulled myself over the parapet, the world erupted. Machine guns chattered from the enemy lines, a sound like ripping canvas, but far more deadly. The air whistled and hissed with bullets, invisible and everywhere at once. Around me men shouted, stumbled, fell. Some managed only 2 steps before crumpling face first into the mud. We had been told to keep moving, to advance at all costs, but the ground itself seemed determined to stop us. Shell craters yawned like open mouths, filled with foul water and broken limbs. I leaped across one and landed hard, nearly dropping my rifle. Smoke and dirt stung my eyes. And when I wiped them clear, I saw nothing but chaos. Figures running, staggering. Collapsing in the churned wasteland, the machine gun fire swept in arcs, cutting men down as though scything wheat. I heard Gene, a boy from my village, cry out just ahead of me. Then he pitched forward without another sound, his helmet rolling away into the muck. I wanted to stop, to help him, but bodies pressed me forward. Behind us, the officers screamed for us to keep advancing, their whistles shrill against the roar. Then the shells began to fall. The ground convulsed beneath me, dirt and fire erupting skyward. My ears rang, my teeth rattled in my skull, and the blast threw men into the air like rag dolls. I saw a man's body lifted whole, then vanish in smoke, nothing left but a torn boot flung into a crater. The stench of burning flesh mingled with cordite until I could hardly breathe. Etienne was beside me for a moment, his grin flashing even here, shouting something I could not hear over the din. Then a crack split the air, and he jerked backward, his chest blooming red. His face slackened, his body folding as if the earth had reached up to claim him. I screamed his name, but my voice was lost in the thunder. For a heartbeat I froze, staring at the place where he had fallen. Then the tide shoved me on, and I left him behind in the mud. I stumbled onward. Half running, half falling, bullets snapping so close, I felt the air shiver against my cheek. My breath came ragged, my chest burning. A shell burst near enough to hurl me to the ground, the impact knocking the wind from me. Mud filled my mouth, my shoulder seared with sudden pain, and for a moment I thought I was done. But when the smoke cleared, I found myself still alive, though the world spun and my arm hung heavy at my side. All around the field was littered with the fallen. Cries of the wounded rose thin and desperate, mingling with the whistle of incoming shells. The assault faltered. What remained of us crawled forward only yards before collapsing into whatever cover we could find. The order to retreat finally came. Though few were left strong enough to obey, by the time I dragged myself back toward our trench, blood soaking my sleeve. The ground behind me was strewn with men I had known, boys who had marched beside me only days before. No man's land had claimed them, and I carried only the knowledge that it might have claimed me as well. When I stumbled back into the trench, I collapsed against the wall, my breath tearing at my chest. My uniform was soaked through, though I could not tell where the mud ended and the blood began. The medic crouched beside me, his hands quick and rough, cutting away the fabric at my shoulder. "You're lucky," he muttered, wrapping the wound in a strip of filthy gauze. "Just a graze," I stared at him, unable to speak. Lucky Etienne lay somewhere out there in the muck. His grin forever silenced, and I was lucky. I tried to stand, but my legs trembled beneath me. Around me, others crawled or staggered into the trench, faces ghostly pale, eyes hollow. Some were carried, their bodies limp, arms dangling. The dugout filled with groans, curses, prayers. The stench of blood mingled with smoke until it was impossible to breathe without tasting iron. It was then that the reality of loss struck me fully. I had seen Etienne fall, but my mind had refused to accept it. Now, as I pressed my back against the dirt wall, I felt the weight of it crush me. He had been my friend, the one who laughed when the rest of us fell silent, who spoke of Marseille as though he could bring its sunlight into the trenches. And in a single heartbeat, he was gone, swallowed by mud and fire. I thought of Louis, who had spoken only nights before about his fiancée's letters. He too had been in the line with us. I did not see him return. I did not dare to ask. The silence of his absence was enough to answer. The officers walked among us, shouting about courage and sacrifice. They spoke of holding ground, of duty to the nation, of victory within reach. But I saw only shattered bodies, men staring blankly at the ground, lips moving without sound. No speech could fill the emptiness left by the friends who would never rise again. My shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. But it was a small pain compared to the wound inside. I closed my eyes and saw Etienne's face again, his grin, his words about returning home by Christmas. That promise now mocked me, echoing in the hollow of my chest. I realized then that survival carried its own burden. The dead were free of fear, free of pain. But we who remained had to carry their absence, their voices, their laughter turned to silence. My wound would heal, but the emptiness left by that day would never close. Asterisk the next morning, before the mud had even dried on our boots, the sergeant barked a new command. Prepare for another assault. His voice cracked with exhaustion, yet he forced it into a shout, as though volume could disguise despair. The words rippled through the trench like a chill wind, leaving us silent, staring at one another with disbelief. We had lost half our company the day before. Etienne was gone. Louis was gone. Jean had fallen in the first minutes. The ground between the lines was still littered with their bodies, the cries of the wounded drifting faintly through the morning haze. And now we were to go again to the same fire, across the same mud, toward the same guns that had already slaughtered us. One man muttered, "It's madness." Another spat into the mud, his lips twisted with bitter fury. Henry, older and wiser than the rest, said nothing, but the look in his eyes was enough. He had seen this before, and he knew what it meant. The lieutenant strode past, his uniform cleaner than ours, though his face was pale. He told us the ground gained yesterday must be held, reinforced, expanded. He spoke of duty, of the honor of France, of history watching. His words rang hollow against the stench of death. We listened, but none of us believed. I felt my stomach knot, my chest tighten. The boy who had once marched from the station with pride, waving to the crowd, was gone. In his place stood someone who understood that our lives were measured in yards of mud, our deaths in reports written by men far from the front. When the whistle finally shrilled again, I obeyed because I had no choice. But as I climbed the ladder, my mind screamed what my lips dared not. This is not courage. This is slaughter. Asterisk that night, after the chaos of another failed assault, we were herded into the dugout like shadows. The space was cramped and foul, the walls dripping with condensation, the air heavy with sweat, smoke, and the sour odor of unwashed bodies. A single candle guttered in the center, its flame trembling as though it too feared being extinguished. We sat in silence at first, each man hunched over, staring at the dirt floor or the rifles propped beside us. The sound of distant artillery rolled overhead, a reminder that the storm never truly ceased. Somewhere far off, the wounded still cried out, their voices carried faintly through the night. I wanted to cover my ears, but the cries slipped through the cracks of the earth itself. Eventually, words began to fill the quiet. Henry pulled a photograph from his breast pocket, the same one he had shown us before, and laid it gently in his lap. "My girls," he said softly, his voice breaking on the words. "They think their father is brave. I only hope I can be." He pressed the picture to his lips, then tucked it away again. Louis, younger than the rest of us, clutched a bundle of letters tied with string. He didn't read them aloud, but his thumb rubbed the edges as though touching the paper was enough to summon his fiancée's presence. "She prays for me every night," he whispered. "I promised her I'd come home." His voice cracked and he looked away, ashamed of his own weakness. Then one man, Andre, usually the loudest among us suddenly, buried his face in his hands and wept. His shoulders shook, the sound raw and helpless. None of us mocked him. Instead, we lowered our eyes, because his grief was our own. We were all carrying the same weight, only he had let his spill into the open. The candle burned lower, shadows stretching across the walls like skeletal fingers. I sat listening, my heart heavy. I thought of my own family, of the promise I had written in my letter. A promise I no longer believed. Around me, the men clung to memories of wives, children, and lovers, as if those fragile images could shield them from the truth. But the truth was already here, pressing down on us like the earth above our heads. That night, in the silence between sobs and whispers, I felt something inside me shift. Whatever faith had carried me this far was fading, replaced by a gnawing emptiness I could not name. Asterisk. When the candle finally guttered out, we were left in darkness, broken only by the faint glow of a cigarette or the glint of a wet eye. I lay on the damp boards, my shoulder aching, my body too tired to move, yet too restless to sleep. The ground above us quaked now and then with distant shells, but it was not the guns that kept me awake. It was the silence inside me. I thought of Etienne, of his laughter echoing in the trench, his grin cut short in a spray of blood. I thought of Jean, whose helmet I had seen rolling into the mud. I thought of Louis clutching those letters as though paper and ink could hold back death. Their faces floated before me, vivid and unrelenting. And I wondered how many more I would watch vanish once. I had believed in the glory of sacrifice. I had believed that courage would shine brighter than fear, that our deaths would mean something beyond these fields. But here, in the damp suffocation of the dugout, those beliefs lay shattered. What had Etienne's courage brought him? What honor was there in Jean's lifeless body? What meaning could be found in the endless mud that swallowed us all? The words of the officers rang hollow. Now talk of duty, of history, of France. They were distant voices, belonging to men who did not wade through this filth, who did not hear the screams in the night. We carried their orders like chains, marching into slaughter. And for the first time, I dared to admit it. This was not heroism. This was madness. I stared into the darkness, my lips moving silently around the question that had begun to haunt me. Was any of this worth it? The silence offered no answer. Only the dripping walls, the rat scratching in the shadows, and the slow, steady beat of my heart proof that I was alive, though I no longer knew why. When the guns finally fell silent, we returned to what was left of our trench. The path back was lined with bodies, some sprawled where they had fallen, others half buried in the churned earth, their faces already fading into the mud. By the time I stumbled through the entrance, it felt as though I were walking into a tomb rather than a refuge. The dugout, once crowded with noise and chatter, now held an eerie quiet. I looked around and saw empty spaces where friends should have been. The bench where Etienne had sat with his grin was vacant, his belongings already gathered by someone else. Louis's letters no longer peeked from his pocket, because he had not returned to carry them. Their absence was louder than any sound. We had begun the assault as a company of 50. Less than half of us came back. The sergeant tried to call the roll, his voice cracking as he reached name after name with no reply. He paused, swallowed hard, and moved on. By the end, the silence stretched longer than the list itself. I sat against the wall, staring at the dirt floor, my body shaking with exhaustion. Around me, men coughed, groaned, or simply lay still, their eyes vacant, their mouths half open. Some wept quietly, others smoked in silence, dragging at cigarettes as though the thin stream of smoke could fill the hollow in their chests. The strange thing was how quickly death became normal. At first we had gasped at each loss, clung to names and faces. Now, the shock was dulled. We nodded grimly when told who had fallen, as if it were another chore to be marked off. Yet the weight pressed harder with each name, a burden too heavy to carry but impossible to set down. That night I realized our unit was no longer whole. It was broken, patched together from survivors who stared at one another with the haunted recognition of men who had seen the same abyss. We were alive, but only by chance. And chance, I knew, would not favor us forever. Asterisk, not long after, I was assigned to a new duty. There were too few of us left to fight, and too many bodies left to tend. The officers ordered me to help with the wounded and the dead. It was work no one wanted, yet it had to be done. At first, I recoiled from it. The wounded cried out as we lifted them onto stretchers, their blood soaking through the rough canvas, their eyes wide with fear. Some begged for morphine, others begged for water, a few begged for their mothers. We carried them across uneven ground, stumbling under the weight, our boots slipping in the mud. Sometimes, by the time we reached the aid station, the cries had already gone silent. The dead were heavier still. Bodies stiffened quickly, their weight awkward and unyielding. We dug shallow graves when we could, though often the ground was too soaked to allow much depth. We laid them down in rows, covering them with earth until only the tips of their boots showed. The chaplain muttered prayers, his voice weary, as though even God had grown tired of hearing them. At first, I could not look at their faces. I turned away as we lowered them, forcing my gaze on the shovel in my hands. But with each passing day, I grew more numb. Soon I was able to dig, to lift, to cover, without flinching. Yet the numbness was not mercied. It was another kind of wound, dull and heavy, settling deeper each time. Still, there were moments when the silence broke. A man I barely knew pressed a hand on my shoulder as we filled a grave. His eyes met mine, hollow but human. In that instant, I felt the fragile thread that kept us alive. Not duty, not orders, but the need to hold one another up when the earth itself tried to swallow us. It was gruesome work. But in it, I found a strange companionship with those who remained. We were gravediggers and stretcher-bearers, not heroes. But perhaps, in some small way, we were keeping the last fragments of humanity intact amid the ruin. Asterisk, one evening. After a day of hauling stretchers and digging graves, the courier handed me a folded envelope. My name was scrawled across it in a familiar, hurried hand. For a moment, I almost didn't want to open it. Letters from home had become fragile, things sometimes carrying warmth, other times sorrow. It was from my sister. The ink was smudged in places, as though her tears had fallen onto the page. She wrote that father had died after a short illness. There had been no money for medicine, no strength left in him to fight. She described how mother had aged years and weeks, her body bent from both grief and labor. The harvest had been poor, and without father's hands, the fields were failing. We manage as best we can, she wrote, but every day feels heavier than the last. I read the words again and again, unable to breathe. I had promised them I would return, that I would help with the harvest, that my leaving would be only for a season. Now father was gone, and I had not been there to hold his hand, not even to stand at his grave. My absence felt like a betrayal, deeper than any wound. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it to my lips, as though I could somehow bridge the distance with a kiss. The men around me smoked and muttered quietly, but the world had gone silent to me. My chest ached with a pain sharper than shrapnel. War had taken Etienne, Louis, and Jean from me at the front. Now it had reached back across the miles and taken my father too. I realized then that the battlefield did not end at the trenches. It stretched into every home, every farm, every heart waiting in vain for someone who would never return. By 1916, the war had grown into something larger than any of us could grasp. We heard the names whispered through the trenches like curses Verdun. The sum, each word carried with it the weight of thousands of lives, as though the very syllables bled. At Verdun, they said. The Germans had vowed to bleed France white. The fighting raged for months, shells raining until the earth itself seemed to vanish beneath the bombardment. Men lived in holes barely big enough to crouch in, their faces gray with powder and exhaustion. The rumor was that entire regiments disappeared in days, swallowed whole by the endless fire. Then came the Somme. Some of our comrades had been sent there, and the stories they brought back chilled us. On the first day alone, tens of thousands of British soldiers were cut down before they had taken even a few yards of ground. Machine guns had scythed through them like tall grass under a scythe. The survivors spoke of bodies piled so thick they formed walls of rivers clogged with blood. The generals called it a necessary offensive, a step toward victory. To us, it sounded like slaughter. We sat in our trench and listened, our faces pale in the candlelight. Every tale carried a warning. The war was no longer a matter of weeks or months, but years. The lines stretched across Europe like scars that would not heal. Each battle promised only more names for the dead and more grief for the living. I felt the hopelessness seep into my bones. Once I had thought our suffering was temporary, that each day might bring the final push. Now I understood we were caught in something vast and merciless. A machine grinding endlessly forward, feeding on men without end. And I wondered when it would be our turn to be fed into its jaws. Asterisk, the longer I remained at the front, the more the question gnawed at me. Should I keep fighting, or should I find any way to survive? Duty had been the word on every poster, every speech, every officer's lips. But duty did not ease the ache in my bones, nor bring back the faces I had lost. I wrestled with it in silence at first, ashamed even to think of it. To speak such doubts aloud felt like betrayal. But doubt has a way of slipping through, and one night in the dugout I heard Henry voicing what I had not dared. "They want us to keep charging until we're all gone," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the dirt floor. "That's not bravery. That's waste." Across from him, another soldier, Jacques, snapped back, "What else can we do? France is counting on us. If we falter, the enemy wins." His words were sharp, but his voice shook, betraying the fear beneath. I sat between them, my heart torn. Henry's bitterness was the truth I felt deep inside. Jacques' defiance was the mask I had once worn proudly. Both men were right, and both were wrong. That night, as I lay awake, I thought of my sister's letter. I thought of father's grave, untended in a field I could no longer reach, of mother breaking her back to keep the farm alive. What would my death add to their suffering? Could honor put bread on their table? Could glory mend a broken family? The choice loomed larger each day. Part of me wanted to keep obeying, to fight on until the war itself decided my fate. But another part whispered of survival, not out of cowardice, but out of a desperate need to live, to return, to hold again the things that mattered more than banners and speeches. And so the question deepened, echoing inside me, was I still a soldier, or merely a man trying to endure? Asterisk, it happened on a gray afternoon when the mist hung low over no man's land. I had been sent with 2 others to check the wire and gather what supplies we could from a shattered outpost. The air was damp, the silence uneasy, broken only by the occasional crack of distant guns. That was when I heard it, a faint, rasping cry. At first I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, weak, yet unmistakable. I followed the sound around a crater and found him, a German soldier, barely older than myself, sprawled on his back, his leg mangled by shrapnel. His helmet had rolled away, his blond hair matted with blood. His lips moved as he whispered Hilf. Bit. For a moment I froze. Here was the enemy, the figure we had been told to hate, to kill without hesitation. Every poster, every order, every speech had painted him as a monster. Yet what lay before me was no monster. He was just a boy, eyes wide with terror, clutching at life with trembling hands. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting a sergeant to appear and drag me back. My heart pounded with the weight of choice. I could leave him to die and no one would question it. Or I could help him and risk being called a traitor. I knelt beside him. His eyes flicked toward mine, startled, then softened with something like relief. I tore a strip from my own bandage and wrapped it clumsily around his wound. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he managed a single word, Danke, with effort. I dragged him toward a ditch where he might be sheltered from the guns. My arms burned, my wound ached, but I kept pulling until he was hidden from sight. Then I left him, praying someone would find him before the night. As I stumbled back, mud clinging to my boots, I realized the war had shifted inside me. The enemy was no longer faceless. He had a voice, a plea, and a family waiting just as mine did. And in saving him, I felt perhaps for the first time that I had done something truly human. By the final months of the war, I was no longer the boy who had marched proudly from the station. I was a hollowed figure, gaunt and weary, my uniform little more than rags clinging to bone. Hope had long since drained from me. Each day was measured not by victories or advances, but by whether I still drew breath when the sun fell. We endured through mud and hunger, through nights broken by shells that never ceased. Yet I lived on, though I no longer knew why. Survival felt less like triumph and more like accident. Friends had fallen, officers had changed, entire companies had vanished. I remained carrying memories heavier than my rifle. Then came November 11th, 1918, at dawn. The guns still thundered, the ground still shook, as it always had, but at the 11th hour, as the clock struck, the firing stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, almost frightening. For 4 years we had known nothing but noise. How could the world suddenly be still? We looked at one another, eyes wide, uncertain whether to believe it. Some cheered, others wept, but most of us simply stood stunned, unable to grasp what had ended. I felt no victory in that silence. Relief, yes, that death had not claimed me in the war's final hour, but also a hollow ache. Etienne, Louis, Jean, and countless others would never hear the silence. They had given everything, and I alone remained. The war was over, they told us. But as I sat in the quiet trench, surrounded by ghosts, I realized that for those of us who survived, the war would never truly end. Asterisk, when I finally returned to my village, it was not the place I had carried in my memory through years of mud and fire. The fields that had once glowed with golden wheat lay barren, scarred by neglect. Roofs sagged, fences leaned broken, and the church bell that had rung on Sundays hung silent. It felt as though war had reached across the miles and hollowed the land as surely as it had hollowed me. I walked the familiar road to my house, but every step felt strange. At the door my mother appeared, older by decades rather than years. Her hair was white, her back bent, her eyes rimmed red from grief and sleepless nights. She reached for me as if to assure herself I was real, then pulled me into her arms with a strength born of desperation. I felt her sobs shake against my chest. My sister stood behind her, taller now, her face pale but steady. She smiled through tears, whispering, "You came back," but the words carried the shadow of all that had been lost. Father's absence lingered in every corner of the house. Every silence at the table, we sat together that evening, reunited yet broken. They wanted to know everything, but I found I could say very little. How could I speak of the trenches, of the dead, of the noise that still roared in my ears, even in this quiet home? I watched their faces in the lamplight and felt both gratitude and distance. I had survived the war. But as I looked around at my changed home, I realized I had returned to someone they no longer fully knew. I was a stranger in my own house, carrying shadows they could not see. Asterisk peace did not bring rest. At night, I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing to the rhythm of guns that were no longer there. In dreams, the shells still fell, the air still split with screams, and the mud pulled me down into darkness. Sometimes I smelled blood where there was none, or heard the rattle of machine guns and the rustle of wind through the trees. The war had left the battlefield, but it had not left me. By day, I tried to work the land again, but the fields seemed foreign, as though I had never known them. The soil no longer felt like life, but like the same dirt that had swallowed my friends. I dug with a spade and saw a shovel caked in trench mud. I lifted hay and smelled cordite. Every task carried a shadow. Every silence was too loud. Neighbors spoke of glory, of sacrifice, of how we had defended the nation. Their words rang hollow in my ears. Glory had not been in the trenches, only hunger, filth, and death. Sacrifice was not banners and speeches. It was Etienne's grin cut short, Louis's letters left unread, Jean's name unanswered at roll call. What remained was not pride, but scars invisible to anyone but those who carried them. I tried to smile for my mother, to reassure my sister, but the weight inside me never lifted. They could not see the ghosts that walked beside me, nor hear the whispers that crowded my nights. I had come home alive, yet part of me was still buried in France's mud. The uniform was gone, but the war had stitched itself into my skin. Asterisk. We'll never see my name etched in the histories of battles or engraved on monuments. I was a nameless soldier, one of millions swallowed by the Great War. But I remember every face of those who marched beside me. I remember Etienne's laughter, Louis's trembling hands clutching letters, Jean's steady voice when he promised we'd all return by Christmas. Their names may fade, but in me they endure. When I close my eyes, I still see them, hear them, feel the weight of their absence. It is not glory that lingers, it is grief. Not banners or parades, but the silence left behind by so many voices gone. I learned that the true cost of war is not written in victories or treaties, but in the hollow spaces at every table, in the letters never answered, in the sons who did not return to those who come after us. I say this: peace is not a gift to be taken lightly. It is the greatest treasure we can hold. Never believe those who speak of the romance of war. I have seen its truth, and there is no beauty in it, only loss, only shadows. I survived, though I am not whole. Part of me still lies in the trenches, buried with the men I called brothers. Remember us, and let our memory stand as a warning, never again.